She wasn't supposed to be this nervous. It was just a handshake, just a name, just a man standing at the end of a gravel driveway in the middle of nowhere, Alberta, watching her car pull up like he'd been counting the seconds and resenting every one of them. Maren Colby stepped out of the car, and immediately her boot found a patch of mud that hadn't quite frozen over yet. She caught herself on the door handle. He didn't move to help her. He just watched. That was the first thing she noticed about Calloway. No, not Calloway, that name was taken. About Silas Vane. The way he watched. Not with cruelty, not with warmth. Just with this flat, patient attention, like a man who had learned a long time ago that most things weren't worth rushing toward. "You're Maren," he said, not a question. "And you're Silas." She straightened, mud on her boot, hair half pulled loose by the November wind, feeling precisely as composed as she looked. Which was not very. He nodded once. Turned toward the house. "Come inside before the cold gets mean." She grabbed her bag from the back seat. He didn't offer to take it. She told herself she didn't mind. The arrangement had been her aunt's idea, which was the most important thing to understand about how Maren Colby ended up in Heron Flats, Alberta, 3 days after her 28th birthday, carrying a duffel bag and a folder of legal documents into a stranger's farmhouse. Her Aunt June had known Silas Vane's mother. Cards at Christmas, phone calls on birthdays, the kind of friendship that outlasts proximity because it's built on something more durable than convenience. When Silas's mother passed spring, June had driven out for the service. She'd come back with a strange quietness about her, and 3 weeks later, a proposal. Not for herself. For Maren. "He needs someone," June had said, sitting at Maren's kitchen table in Edmonton, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "The farm needs someone, and you." She'd looked at Maren in that particular way she had. The one that saw too much. "You need somewhere to be." Maren had laughed. Then she'd stopped laughing. The truth was that she'd spent the better part of 2 years being nowhere. After the relationship with Daniel ended being a generous word for what had actually happened, which was that she'd come home one afternoon to find half the furniture gone, and a note that used the phrase, "I need to find myself," unironically. She'd been adrift in a way she didn't have language for. She'd kept working. She kept calling her mother on Sundays. She did all the things that looked like a life from the outside. But she'd stopped feeling like she lived anywhere, like she belonged anywhere, like there was any place on earth that was actually hers. Silas Vane's farm was 312 acres of frozen prairie, a cattle operation that had been in his family for 4 generations, and a house that smelled like wood smoke and old coffee. It was not, by most measures, a romantic proposition, and yet, here she was. The legal side was straightforward enough. A contract her aunt's lawyer had drawn up. A marriage of arrangement that would last 2 years, during which Maren would help manage the household and the farm's administrative work, and in exchange she would receive a salary, housing, and at the end of the contract, a share of a small property her aunt had left in both their names. A practical solution, June had called it. A fair exchange. What June had not quite prepared her for was the man himself. Silas Vane was 34 years old, 6'2", with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of hands that came from decades of actual work. He wasn't unkind. That was the thing Maren kept coming back to in those first days, when she was still mapping out the geography of the house, still learning which burner on the stove ran hot, still waking up in the night not knowing where she was. He wasn't unkind, he just wasn't open. He handed her coffee in the mornings without being asked after the 3rd day, because he'd noticed when she woke up and what she reached for first. He fixed the latch on her bedroom window without her mentioning it, because the wind had been rattling it, and he'd heard. Small attentions. Quiet ones. But when she tried to talk to him, really talk, the kind of talking that builds something between 2 people, he'd go still and polite, in a way that felt like a door closing gently in her face. She asked about the farm. He answered in specifics. Acreage, cattle count, the price of feed this winter versus last, the well that needed its pump replaced before February. She asked about the town. He told her where the hardware store was, where to get groceries, warned her the road into Heron Flats got icy by the bridge. She asked once, carefully, about his mother. He was quiet for a long moment. "She ran this place better than I ever have," he said finally. She knew everyone, every neighbor by name, every cow by temperament. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking from it. "I'm better with the land than with people," Maren thought. "I know, I can see that. I can also see that it costs you something," She didn't say it. Not then. The town of Heron Flats received her with the careful, watchful politeness of a place that has learned to wait before it decides what it thinks of someone new. The woman at the post office, Mrs. Birch, stout, efficient, deeply curious, had taken one long look at her left hand and said, "Oh, you're Silas's wife." The word had done something strange to Maren's chest. "I am," she said. "He came in here every week for 10 years and barely said 3 words," Mrs. Birch said. "His mother used to say he swallowed his feelings so young he forgot he had them." She handed Maren a parcel. "I hope you're patient. I'm trying to be." The man at the feed supply, Dougal, who wore the same canvas jacket every day regardless of temperature, had been less subtle. "Didn't think Silas had it in him," he'd said, not meanly, just honestly, the way men in small towns often say things they haven't thought to filter. "Good for him. Good for both of you." Maren had smiled and loaded the bags into the truck and driven home on the icy road by the bridge, very carefully. What nobody in Heron Flats knew, what she hadn't told anyone, not even June, not in full, was what she was also running from. Daniel hadn't just left. That would have been survivable. People leave. Maren knew that. What Daniel had done on his way out was ensure that the lease on the apartment was only in her name, that the shared savings account, the one they'd been putting money into for years, had a withdrawal that predated the note by 11 days, that the job she'd gotten through his recommendation, the office manager position at a company where his brother was a partner, had quietly, and then not so quietly, become untenable. She'd left that job in March. By May, she was living on savings that were not as substantial as she'd believed. By August, she was subletting a room in a house with 2 university students who played music at hours that suggested they did not experience time the way other humans did. And then her aunt had called. There were people Maren had come to understand, who moved through the world trailing wreckage and never looked back. Daniel was one of them. He'd moved on. She'd seen it, briefly, on the kind of social media she should have stopped checking, to someone bright and uncomplicated and probably very happy to meet him, because she didn't know yet what Maren had learned. Maren had also moved on, just in a direction nobody would have predicted, including herself. The first week of December brought a cold that had weight to it, the kind that pressed against the windows, and made the house feel like a held breath. Silas went out before sunrise and came back after dark, and in between Maren learned the rhythms of the house. The furnace that kicked on at 6, the particular creak of the 3rd step on the stairs, the sound the cattle made when they were settled versus when something was wrong. She started keeping the accounts. Silas had been doing them in a ledger, paper, with handwriting that was precise and slightly cramped, and she'd asked if she could move them to a spreadsheet, and he'd looked at her for a moment and said, "If you want to," as if the idea of someone wanting to spend time on his farm's finances was slightly beyond comprehension. She wanted to. She found it calming, the columns of numbers, the clarity of a budget that could be understood and managed. She'd been an office manager for years. Order was something she understood. She cross-referenced his ledger with the receipts he kept in a coffee can on the kitchen counter and found 3 months of errors, 2 of which had cost him money he didn't know he was losing. She showed him after dinner one evening, her laptop on the kitchen table, the numbers laid out. He leaned over her shoulder and looked. She was aware of how close he was. The smell of cold air and work. "That's—" He stopped. "About $430, she said, "in overcharges. From the co-op. If you bring the receipts, they'll correct it." He straightened, looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "Why didn't they catch that themselves?" "Because you weren't asking them to." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Thank you." It was a small thing, but the way he said it, quiet and direct and without deflection, felt like more than just politeness. It felt like he was seeing her, actually seeing her. She turned back to the screen so he wouldn't see her expression. Christmas came and went with a quiet that felt earned rather than empty. Silas had driven into Red Deer for supplies and come back with a small spruce tree he'd cut himself, which he set up in the corner of the living room without ceremony and without explanation. Maren found a box of old ornaments in the hall closet, glass, hand-painted, the kind that took decades to accumulate, and asked if he wanted her to put them up. He'd looked at the box for a long moment. "Those were my mother's." "I know," she said gently. "Yeah," he said. "Put them up." She did. He stood in the doorway and watched. She didn't make it a moment, didn't try to draw him into anything he wasn't ready for. She just hung the ornaments, one by one, the old glass catching the lamplight, and when she was done she stepped back and looked at the tree and said, "She had good taste. She had good taste in most things," he said. There was something rough in his voice that he smoothed over quickly. "I'm going to check on the herd." He went out into the dark. Maren sat by the tree for a while. When he came back an hour later, he brought 2 mugs of tea. She'd been teaching him the difference between tea made properly and tea made the way he'd been making it, which was essentially hot brown water, and sat in the chair across from her. And for the first time since she'd arrived, they talked. Not about the farm. Not about logistics. He asked her about Edmonton, about what she'd done there, what she'd liked. She told him about the bookstore she'd gone to every Saturday morning, the one on 124th Street that smelled like old paper and was run by a man who never remembered your face but always remembered what you'd bought. She told him about her friend Delia. No, different name. Her friend Siurse, which Silas had to have spelled for him, which made Maren laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. He didn't talk about himself, but he listened with the same flat, patient attention he'd turned on her that first day in the driveway, and she realized it didn't feel like detachment. It felt like concentration. Like she was something worth understanding. She drove home that night. She caught herself. She was home. This was home. And lay in bed listening to the wind and thought about that. The trouble came in January, the way trouble often does in that month, without warning, and at the worst possible hour. His name was Warren Shell, and he'd been Silas Vane's business partner for 6 years. Maren learned about him on a Thursday morning when a truck she didn't recognize pulled into the yard and a man got out who moved with the ease of someone who expected to be welcomed everywhere he went. He was Silas's age, maybe a little older, with the kind of smile that worked better in photographs than in person. "Warren Shell," he said, extending his hand to Maren before she'd even said a word. "Business partner, and you must be the wife." The word came out coded in a particular kind of amusement that she recognized immediately and did not like at all. "Maren Vane," she said, using the name steadily, watching his face. Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly. Like he'd been expecting uncertainty and gotten something else instead. Silas came out of the barn, and the 2 men shook hands. And Maren watched the whole thing from the porch, with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, trying to identify what it was about Warren Shell that made the back of her neck prickle. It wasn't until dinner. He'd stayed for dinner. Apparently this was normal. Silas had the look of a man tolerating something he'd long since stopped arguing about, that she began to understand. Warren talked about the property, about expansion, about a deal he'd been working on with a land developer out of Calgary who was interested in the northeast quarter of the Vane land, the quarter that bordered the creek, the one that had been in the family longest. He talked about it the way a man talks about something he's already decided, not something under discussion. Silas ate and said little. This, Maren had learned, was not unusual. But his hands, when he set down his fork, were very still. After Warren left, she washed the dishes and Silas sat at the table and didn't move. "You don't want to sell that quarter," she said. "Not a question." "No." "Then don't." He looked at her. "Warren has a stake in the operation, bought in 6 years ago when my father's medical bills." He stopped. Reorganized. "He has a legal interest in decisions about the land." How much of a legal interest? Enough to make things complicated. Maren dried her hands on the dish towel, sat down across from him. "Show me the partnership agreement." He looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes and didn't look away. "You're an office manager," he said. "Was," she said, "and yes. Show me the agreement." She read it that night, twice. The partnership agreement was 12 pages of the kind of legal language that needed patience rather than expertise to get through, and what it said, once she'd mapped it out clearly, was that Warren Shell had a 30% ownership stake and the right to be consulted on major land decisions, but that any sale required majority agreement, which meant Silas could not be forced. What it also said, in a clause on page 9 that had clearly been added after the original signing, was that in the event of Silas's death or incapacitation, Warren's stake increased to 51%. She read that clause 3 times. She went downstairs at 11:30 and knocked on Silas's bedroom door. She heard him move, heard the creak of the floor. "Maren, I need you to look at something." He opened the door. He was dressed, which she registered with some surprise, and she realized he probably hadn't been sleeping either. She put the agreement on the hall table and pointed to page 9. He read it. His face didn't change much, but she'd learned to read the small signals. The way his jaw tightened, the stillness. "I didn't put that in," he said. "I know. Warren's lawyer sent the revised agreement. I signed without." He stopped. "Without reading page 9. Yes, okay," she said. "Okay, we need a lawyer. Not Warren's lawyer and not anyone in Heron Flats who might know Warren. Someone from Red Deer or Calgary." He looked at her. "This is what I'm good at," she said. "This, finding the problem in the numbers, in the documents. This is what I actually do." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she started to think she'd overstepped, that she'd pushed into something that wasn't hers to push into. Then he said, "I know a lawyer in Red Deer. My mother used her for the estate. Can you call her tomorrow?" "Yes." Maren nodded. Started back toward the stairs. "Maren." She stopped. "I'm sorry," he said. "That you had to find this. Don't be sorry," she said. "I'm glad I found it now rather than later." She went back to bed and lay staring at the ceiling and tried very hard not to think about what later might mean. The weeks that followed had a quality she would later struggle to describe. Tense, yes, but also clarifying, the way a cold morning clarifies the air. The lawyer in Red Deer was a woman named Agnes. No, already on the list. A woman named Rowena Fitch, who was precise and unhurried, and took one look at the amended clause on page 9 and said, "This is interesting," in the tone of someone who meant it was very much not interesting in a good way. The challenge to the clause took time. Warren Shell, when he understood that Silas had engaged a lawyer, shifted from pleasant to something else. He started stopping by more often, unannounced, with the casual ease of someone testing a boundary. He talked about the Calgary developer in front of Maren with pointed specificity, numbers and timelines that he knew she'd relay to Silas. She relayed them, and then she also told Silas about the way Warren looked at the land. Not like a partner, like a patient man waiting for an inheritance. "He's been waiting since my father got sick," Silas said one evening. They were at the kitchen table again. It had become the place where things got said. 6 years, that's a long time to wait," Maren said. "He's good at it." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "He waited while my father died. He waited while my mother ran the operation alone. He waited while I tried to hold it together. He's very patient. Then we can't let him wait long enough." Silas looked at her. There was something in his expression that she'd been seeing more often lately and still didn't quite know what to do with. Something that was less like a door closing and more like a door standing open in uncertain weather. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean? This isn't what you signed on for." He set down the mug. "The contract says household management, administrative work. Not this. This is administrative work, Maren." The furnace kicked on. The wind moved against the windows. "Because it matters," she said finally. "This farm matters. It's 4 generations, Silas. That's not nothing." She paused. "And because." She stopped. Tried again. "Someone should be in your corner. Properly. Not because it's in the contract." He didn't say anything. But something in his face changed. The particular stillness he carried, the one she'd been reading as distance, shifted into something else. Something she didn't have a clean name for but recognized anyway. The legal challenge took until March. What Rowena Fitch discovered, after 3 months of correspondence and the careful unraveling of 6 years of amended documents, was that Warren Shell had also made unauthorized use of a joint account in a way that, combined with the clause page 9, and 2 other discrepancies Maren had found buried in 2 years of financial records, amounted to something a great deal more serious than sharp business practice. Warren didn't go quietly. He hired his own lawyer, better paid and louder, and for several weeks the matter threatened to become the kind of protracted dispute that drains people of money and will simultaneously. It was Maren who found the email. Not because she'd been looking for it. She'd been going through old correspondence that Silas had given her to archive, the mundane business of years of farming operations. And there it was, a thread from 4 years ago, between Warren and a contact she didn't recognize, discussing the Vane property in a way that left no ambiguity about what Warren had always intended. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and read it twice. Then she called Rowena Fitch. Rowena Fitch said in her unhurried way, "Send it to me." The matter was resolved 6 weeks later. The clause on page 9 was struck out. Warren Shell's stake in the operation was bought out at assessed value, which was considerably less than he'd been counting on. He did not, in the end, get to wait long enough. The day it was final, Silas came in from the barn at noon, which he never did, and stood in the kitchen doorway. "It's done," he said. Maren looked up from the table. She'd known it was coming. Rowena had called that morning. But hearing him say it was different. "Yeah," she said. He crossed the kitchen, stood at the table, looked at her with that expression she'd been seeing for months and still didn't quite know how to read, except that it was nothing like the flat, patient distance of that first day in the driveway. "I don't know how to do this," he said. She wasn't sure for a moment what he meant. "Say thank you," he said, properly. "For what you—" He stopped. Silas Vane, she had learned, sometimes needed a moment to find the word that was actually true, rather than the one that was merely available. "For what you actually did here, which is save something I didn't know how to save myself." She looked at him. "You would have figured it out. Maybe, eventually." He put his hands flat on the table. "Not before Warren had what he wanted." She nodded, didn't look away. "I know the contract ends in September," he said. She said nothing. "I know that's what you agreed to, what we both agreed to." He paused. "I'm asking you to consider," another pause. "I'm asking if you'd consider that September doesn't have to be the end of it." The kitchen was very quiet. The furnace was off. The wind had settled for once. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Yes," he said. No deflection, no qualification. Just the single word. Direct and true. She'd come to Heron Flats running from a life that had been hollowed out from the inside. She'd come for practical reasons, sensible reasons, the kind of reasons that could be written into a contract. She'd come without expecting much, because expecting things had become something she'd learned to be careful about. But somewhere between the frozen mud of that first driveway and the lamplight on those old glass ornaments and the kitchen table at 11:30 with a legal document between them, she'd stopped running. She'd stopped waiting to leave. "September doesn't have to be the end of it," she said. He looked at her. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Silas Vane smiled. Fully. Without caution. It changed his whole face. She thought, there it is. There's the person who was in there this whole time. April came with the particular relief of a Canadian spring, hesitant and then sudden, the fields going from white to brown, to the first thin green that felt like a small miracle every year. Maren drove into Heron Flats for the mail, and Mrs. Birch gave her a long, satisfied look and said nothing at all, which was somehow more eloquent than anything she might have said. Dougal at the feed supply said, "You two figured it out then," which was not a question. "We're working on it," Maren said. "Good," he said. "Good." She loaded the bags into the truck and drove home on the road by the bridge, which had finally thawed enough to be merely cautious rather than treacherous. The farm came into view at the top of the hill, the house and the barn, and the long sweep of the fields going green at the edges, and she thought, 4 generations. She pulled into the yard, and Silas came out of the barn and watched her park, the same way he'd watched her pull in that first day in November. But this time when she got out of the truck he walked over, and she handed him the heaviest bag without thinking about it. And he took it without thinking about it. And they walked into the house together in the ordinary way of two people who belonged to a place and to each other. The chickens were healthy. The cattle were settled. The accounts balanced to the last cent. It wasn't a small thing. It was everything.